It is a great honor to welcome Professor Stanley Payne of the University of Wisconsin-Madison to the show once again. He used to teach history there. He's now Professor Emeritus, and he is the foremost authority on the history of modern Spain. And in this hour, we are discussing his wonderful book, The Franco Regime, 1936 to 1975. Welcome to the show, Stanley. Once again, how are you doing?
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, let's begin by asking you, how is Franco remembered in today's Spain?
Quite variously, and with considerable difference in various sectors of the population. Because beginning about the start of the 21st century, Franco became the principal boogeyman of Spanish politics again. After Franco died, the institutions of the regime opened up and made possible the transition to democracy. And all the major sections of Spanish politics agreed that they would draw a veil over history for partisan political purposes and leave history to the historians. Complete freedom of research and publicity, but not use history and arguments from the recent past in partisan politics. That agreement lasted for most of the rest of the 20th century, and it changed in the 1990s when the socialists were on the edge of losing an election for the first time in more than 10 years. And in the 21st century, with the transition to a more radical kind of wokist politics by the left, the socialists and the ex-communists, arguments of history have been made very prominent with new law of historical censorship, and Franco has been made the main boogeyman of left-wing politics, to the extent that leftist politicians will sometimes say, when asked what their ideology is, they are anti-Francoists, though Franco has now been dead for half a century. So for the left, Franco has become the main boogeyman again. On the other hand, the most common attitude among Spanish citizens in general is to say that Franco is a complicated person, a complex historical experience. He did some bad things and he did some good things. You can divide Spanish opinion in general into three different categories. Those who say that Franco is all bad were a minority. Those who say Franco is all good, even smaller minority. And the plurality who say that Franco was a peculiar mixture of the good and the bad.
Okay. I recently read that Pope Francis nominated a handful of Spanish clergymen who were martyred in the Civil War or before the Civil War for beatification or sainthood. And that triggered a pretty intense reaction from the people who said that that legitimized the Franco regime. So I think if you do pay attention to that, so what was the historical status of Catholics before Franco came to power?
The Catholic Church had been the established religion of Spain down to 1931. Then came the Second Republic, which was a new radical democratic regime, disestablished the church and state, and more than that, began to reverse things by initiating a degree of repression and persecution of the church and of Catholic activities. That was not popular. And once the political pendulum began to swing in Spain, it went in the other direction in 1933, only 2 years after the Republic came in. But then when the Popular Front, in the final elections of February 1936, managed to manipulate the elections enough to win a decisive victory, then a general process of persecution and ostracism began vis-a-vis the clergy and the Catholic Church in general, going down to the Civil War that began 5 months later. And once the Civil War began, there started a massive persecution of the church and of the clergy and of Catholic laymen as well, which really had no other parallel in the 20th century, except possibly in the Soviet Union. And even in the Soviet Union, during the Russian Civil War, Lenin and the communists were rather more crafty and did not make the persecution of the established church a major goal while the Civil War was going on, and only turned to persecution of religion in a big way after the Civil War had been won. But a feature of the revolutionary Spanish Civil War was that the revolutionary left wanted to prosecute the Civil War and the violent revolution at the same time, so that one got in the way of the other. And the revolutionary left concentrated almost more on persecuting the clergy and Catholicism in general, killing priests in large numbers. Nearly 7,000 were massacred, many other Catholic laymen as well, closing and burning churches. All the churches were closed, several hundred were burned. The priceless artwork from the centuries went up in flames. All this was done while the Civil War was going on. And of course, once Franco won the Civil War, then things moved entirely in the opposite direction. The church was reestablished once more, and the regime spent a lot of money rebuilding churches and re-elaborating Catholic society, so that Spain underwent a kind of religious counter-revolution in the 1940s and going into the 1950s. The most elaborate religious revival probably seen in any country in the 20th century, rather like the Muslim revivals you might see in parts of the non-Western world later on during the 20th century. There were many nominal martyrs, and it was Pope John Paul who began the process of identifying and beatifying martyrs of the church and elevating clergy and other persecuted and slain people to sainthood. That began under John Paul and it's continued right down to the present time. So we have a large number of the martyred, something like the last count, maybe 600 or more, who have been elevated to sainthood or in the process of being elevated at the present time, the largest single set of martyrs from the 20th century, even though the 20th century was the century that around the world registered the largest number of Christian martyrs of any century in recorded history.
So give us a brief overview of Franco's military career up to the fall of the Second Republic.
Francisco Franco became the most prestigious general in the Spanish army by the 1930s because of his illustrious military combat record in the army in general, and also because he was a very professional soldier, not given to politics. The paradox of Franco's career is the man who became probably the leading political general of the 20th century rose to prominence in Spain because he was not a political general. He was the leading professional military figure whom you could count on to get professional military work done. He had made his reputation in the Moroccan campaigns of the 19 teens and 20s. This was the most extended colonial type war going on anywhere in the Afro-Asian world, carried on by a European power during that period. And he had risen to very near the top of the military hierarchy then, and even more under the Second Republic. What Franco had done was to stay out of politics. And this made his political luster seem even greater at a time when there was so much political tension and division in the country. He himself was always a conservative, had been a monarchist. He accepted the republic. He said that Spanish public opinion, had accepted the republic, even though its origins were anomalous and not strictly legal. It was introduced by a kind of civilian coup d'etat, but he said it's become the law of the land, and everyone should respect it and try to serve the republic and make it successful because it's the only regime we have. And if this goes down, everything is going to get worse. And he was quite right about that. As the country became more and more divided, he was not eager to have the army enter politics because he said that although military intervention seems easy, a simple solution to political turmoil, nonetheless, having the army take over the government can create more problems than it solves and make everything worse. So in fact, he was against military conspiracy and attempted a military coup d'etat and held out against that until the very last minute in 1936. It was only 1 week before the military insurrection began in July 1936 that Franco finally said he would join the insurrection, because he said by that time the situation had deteriorated so much and everything was so bad that this was the only hope, and you had to just hope for the best and bite the bullet. Once that began, however, the leaders of the military insurrection began to fall by the wayside. Excuse me. The top general was killed, and the others could not easily rise to the top. And Franco became the leader of the military insurrection. His idea had been that what they would do would be to reform the republic and turn a radical republic, even though nominally a democratic one, into a conservative republic, kind of like the sort of republic that existed in Portugal, or maybe a regime like the Catholic regime in Austria. That's what he had in mind, but he found that he was leading a struggle against an all-out mass violent revolution on the part of the revolutionary left. The Spanish version of the numerous revolutionary civil wars that existed in Europe during the first half of the 20th century. And that therefore his regime had to be, in its own way, not just a conservative reform, but a radical counter-revolutionary regime. Franco had probably never heard of Joseph de Maistre, the French language master of counter-revolutionary thought in the early 19th century. De Maistre had said that if you have a counter-revolution, you're not simply opposing revolution. A counter-revolution is the opposite kind of revolution, bringing out a revolution in the opposite direction. De Maistre, as an all-out reactionary, opposed counter-revolution. Franco decided, however, in that situation, that Spain needed a counter-revolution, a completely new kind of regime, a drastic new nationalist authoritarian regime. And that's the sort of thing that he began to create in the autumn of 1936, soon after the Civil War began.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned de Maistre. I'm reading his great work, Considerations sur la France, Considerations on France, and it's a masterful book of political prose. Now, speaking of philosophy, I wonder if the thoughts of the great Jose Ortega y Gasset played an important part of either the First or the Second Republic before the war began.
It seemed as though Ortega would play a part in the beginning of the Second Republic. Ortega himself was a liberal, but a moderate liberal. And he had a remarkable capacity of being wrong about Spanish politics. The craziest ideas about Spain are developed by Spaniards themselves, not by foreign critics of Spain. And when the military had overthrown in a bloodless pronunciamiento the parliamentary regime under the monarchy in 1923, Ortega had hailed the new moderate dictatorship, saying this was a marvelous solution for all the reforms that Spain was going to need, and these could be now carried out bloodlessly and rapidly by an authoritarian system. Well, the mild dictatorship of the 1920s tried that, very successful economically, not successful politically. So Ortega was dead wrong about that. That was a very common liberal opinion in 1923. Then in 1931, Ortega said, the monarchy is finished. The only thing we'll do is a new republic. We need a new liberal, very liberal constitutional republic. And he got it. But as soon as the republic was organized, it turned out it was being led almost exclusively by left liberal radicals and not by constitutional liberals. And only a year or so later, Ortega declared that he was retiring from public life because you couldn't do anything with a radical republic. It was too destructive and too irresponsible. So he was 0 for 2, and he pulled out altogether. Ortega's kind of liberalism was elitist liberalism. It was really an old-fashioned 19th century kind of liberalism, which had existed in Spain in the 19th century and had made some notable achievements. It was considerably bypassed by the revolutionary radicalism of the 20th century. And therefore, Ortega was in retirement by the time the Civil War began. And he found that though he was initially trapped in the revolutionary zone, the so-called Republican zone, he'd better get out as soon as possible because he was being threatened with execution. So within just a few months, he went into exile. And being embarrassed by all his political mistakes, Ortega said nothing about the Spanish Civil War, except in his epilogue for Englishmen in the 1938 reprint edition of the Revolt of the Masses. He said the important thing for foreigners to understand about the Spanish Civil War is not so much the Civil War itself, but just how it began under a radical and irresponsible republic. But that's all he said. Now, the people who claim most to have been inspired by Ortega in Spanish politics were those of Falange Española, the Spanish phalanx. This was the main Spanish attempt at an elitist, fascist-style movement. And they said that Ortega's call for a new national elite for reforms was their principal cultural inspiration. So he was claimed by the leaders of a new Spanish fascism, which was an embarrassment to him, so that encouraged him to stay out of politics even more. Didn't go back to Spain until 1946 and devoted himself exclusively to philosophical writing for the rest of his life. The political enterprises of José Ortega y Gasset, who was, as you imply, undoubtedly Spain's leading intellectual in the first half of the 20th century, were a disastrous failure. And he spent the entire latter part of his life not opining about politics anymore.
No, it's remarkable that the thoughts of Ortega were found to be inspiring by the Phalangists who were associated with fascism. So I suppose that brings me to, is it fair to label the Falange Española fascist?
Yes, it is. There's some controversy about that, because the Falange, as it was picked up by Franco in 1937 and made the official state party, the Partido Único of his long-lived dictatorship, survived all the way down to 1977, known for much of his life simply as the Movimiento Nacional, the national movement, no longer the Falange, so that it survived into the post-fascist era. and into the de-fascistized phase of the long Franco regime. And more in the post-fascist era, the supporters of the party and the movement, its members and leaders and others, like to emphasize that it was a different kind of radical nationalist reform movement and not just a fascist party. What was characteristic of European fascism during the heyday of fascism in the 1930s and early 40s was that the European fascist movements were the most ultra-nationalist political movements in the world. And as ultra-nationalist movements, each nationalist party emphasized peculiarities of its own nation and its own culture, sometimes of its own national religion. So there was more variation between different kinds of fascism than there was between different kinds of communism or different kinds of anarchism or different forms of Maoism later on, and so forth. The fascist movements were highly individualized, but they had a kind of common identity in terms of a basic fascist core. And Falange Española had been inspired originally by Italian fascism, the original fascism of the 1920s, the West European type of fascism, more moderate, more liberal, even in a certain sense, more progressive. And in this way, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, the leader of the Falange down to the time of his execution in the Civil War, could be both an idiosyncratic kind of fascist and a self-confessed follower of Ortega y Gasset, because Ortega was the kind of old-fashioned liberal who had always emphasized elitism. And the elitism of Ortegian liberalism and his emphasis on change and progress and new things fit the Phalangists with their idea of elitist nationalism and elitist nationalist leadership and reform, even if of an authoritarian kind. So it might seem paradoxical, but in fact, if you look at the inner dynamics of the ideas, there were aspects of them that clearly did fit together.
Now, aside from the Falange, what were the other prominent right-wing movements or political entities of Spain at that time?
Spain was very rich in political movements of all kinds, left, right, and center. It had more different kinds of revolutionary movements than any other country in Europe. And in addition to the revolutionary Phalangists, there were various conservative movements. The dissident monarchists, the Spanish Carlists, stemmed from 19th century monarchism and even more from the old regime. They were the extreme right, the farthest right of all rights, standing for the old style, pre-French revolutionary kind of monarchism. The main set of Spanish conservatives were the Catholic conservatives. The Catholic conservatives were organized behind a movement known by its acronym, the CEDA, the CEDA, standing for the Spanish Confederation of Autonomous Rightist Movements, because they had different groups in different provinces. The CEDA stood for Catholic conservatism and for political pragmatism and possibilism. They didn't like the Republic, but on the other hand, they accepted the Republic had a democratic constitution, even if the democratic constitution was not being followed in practice, and that you could use the democratic constitution to reform the Republic and make it a more cooperative kind of republic, semi-parliamentary, but only partially parliamentary, and stay within the legal framework and have a kind of cooperative republic, perhaps more like the right-wing republic in Portugal or the right-wing republic in Austria, both of which were Catholic regimes. So that was the dominant kind of conservatism in Spain under the Republic, a kind of not Republican conservatism, but semi-Republican Catholic conservatism.
Right.
Then there were the right radical monarchists, the right radicals who stopped just short of fascism, but rejected Catholic politics as such. And the old style monarchists of the Carlists, saying that what the Spanish right needed was a modern kind of authoritarian monarchism, a modern reformist regime that would take over 20th century problems and provide 20th century solutions for 20th century problems with a cooperative authoritarian government under a monarchy. But they were a minor group that never mobilized more than 10% of public opinion. Although Spain was known for revolutionary politics, in fact, there were just about as many anti-revolutionaries as revolutionaries in Spain. That's why there was such a big civil war that went on for so long. And Spanish politics really comprised a very broad gamut of things with a lot of vehement opinions. The opinions were too vehement and too little disposed to compromise on most sides, particularly on the sides of the revolutionaries, but on the sides of many people on the right as well.
Okay. So to what extent is Manuel Azaña, the president of the Second Republic, to blame for the failure of his regime?
Manuel Azaña was certainly very responsible for political outcomes in Spain. But as a Republican, as president, he was only the second president. He only took over as president in the spring of 1936, just before the Civil War began. And I would say that both the presidents of the Republic had much to do with the failure of the Republic. The first president before Azaña was Niceto Alcalá Zamora. And Alcalá Zamora was a Catholic liberal, but he was one of the grave diggers of the Republic, mainly because of his own political ego. He wanted to dominate Spanish politics, and he manipulated and divided the centrist and conservative parties so that he could control Republican government and managed to maneuver Republican politics into a one-way street without an exit and into general breakdown. He annoyed people on the left, the right, and the center. And he was finally voted out by Parliament in April 1936, and they brought Azaña in as the second president. Azaña was no better because he was completely focused on one side as a sectarian leader, as the de facto leader of the new Popular Front. Azaña was a liberal, but a radical liberal, a Jacobin kind of liberal. And he too only led a minority of Spanish opinion. He realized that as the leader of a party that only got about 15% of the vote, he had to rely on the socialists, who were revolutionaries. So he was one of the main creators of the Popular Front, which was an alliance of the moderate left, of radical liberals, and the main revolutionary left of the revolutionary socialists. But this was a very unstable alliance, which insisted on more and more radical and destructive politics, highly sectarian and exclusive policies that broke down any kind of national agreement in the spring of 1936 and led to the outbreak of the Civil War. Once the Civil War began, Azaña, as the president, had to decide how to fight the Civil War. Half the army came out in insurrection against the Republican government. And basically, he had three choices. He could use the loyal half of the army to fight the insurrectionary half, although he felt that he wouldn't really count on the loyal half of the army, they might be disloyal. He could do what the insurrectionists wanted, which was to resign and turn over the government to them, as it happened in 1923. Or he could find another way to fight a civil war against the insurrection, And that meant to mobilize all the revolutionary militia. He was very reluctant to do that because he was not himself actually a violent revolutionary. He was somewhat more moderate, but he was extremely sectarian, strongly anti-Catholic, totally opposed to all the right, totally opposed to any compromise or any kind of agreement. And so he decided to arm the revolutionaries and rely on a revolutionary army to fight the Civil War. But that guaranteed that it would be a civil war. And it gave political power no longer to the nominal left Republicans, but to the outright violent revolutionaries. And as I indicated earlier, the revolutionaries were more interested in waging the revolution all out with mass violence than actually with fighting the Civil War. The idea of the anarchists and many of the revolutionary socialists was to wage the revolution and fight the Civil War at the same time. This was not Athana's idea, but they simply bypassed it. For the remainder of the Civil War, Athana became the figurehead. Athana was simply used as the front man for the revolutionaries to say, look, we should be given support by Western democratic governments like those of France and England, because we are a democratic republic. And our leader is the leader of Spanish Republican democracy, Manuel Azaña. But he was merely a figurehead and a front man. And in England, particularly, the British political leaders were astute enough to understand what was going on in Spain, and understand that Azaña was simply a front man, didn't really represent Republican revolutionary politics. But his role during the Civil War was no more than a kind of symbolic figurehead. Everything was run by the revolutionaries during the Civil War. And the only revolutionaries who had any practical sense were the communists, who suddenly came to the forefront. Communism had been growing under the Republic. It was always very secondary prior to the beginning of the Civil War. Spanish communism, of course, was part of the Third International, completely controlled and manipulated from Moscow under the thumb of Stalin. But by 1936, the Soviet communists had had 20 years of experience in operating revolutions. And they had finally given up on the direct Bolshevik way of seizing power themselves by coup d'etat, as Lenin had done in 1917 in Russia, as they tried to do in a good many other countries after that time. They realized after their disastrous failure in Germany, where the insistence on Bolshevik tactics had only led to the victory of Hitler and the suppression of communism and the creation of the Soviet Union's greatest danger in the emergence of a Nazi Germany, they had to follow a more political and indirect route, and therefore they'd adopted the tactic of the Popular Front, which was also embraced by most of the left in Spain. And they had tried to avoid the Civil War because the left had everything under their control prior to July 1936 and was beginning to carry out the revolution initially relatively peacefully with a certain amount of violence, but relatively peacefully without civil war and without having to overthrow the government. The left Republican government had become complicit with the revolution to some extent, a legal revolution. Communists had said on the eve of the Civil War, this is the best of both worlds. For the first time, we have a country like Spain where we can carry out the revolution legally. Let's don't go too far. Don't go too fast. Don't incite the right to rebel. Because if there is rebellion and there were to begin a civil war, in a civil war, two things can happen. One, you win. Two, you lose. That's a 50% chance of losing. And here we have a situation in Spain in the spring of 1936 in which everything is in our favor. There's not a cloud on the horizon. Don't become too radical. Don't become too revolutionary. Don't go too fast. The anarchists and the socialists would pay no attention to them. They pushed things into the Civil War. And then once the Civil War began, the anarchists and the socialists insisted on a violent revolution and fighting the Civil War second. Communists said, this policy is essentially crazy. You've got everything backwards. You've gotten yourself in a desperate civil war. The most important thing, once you get in a major civil war like this, is winning the war. Everything has got to be subordinated to winning the war. That means you have to downplay the revolution. Too much revolution distracts attention, takes away energy from the Civil War. You've got to concentrate on the Civil War and wage the revolution only completely after the Civil War is won. So the communists were the only major political force that had a real program for victory during the Civil War. And curiously, they were supported by the moderate left, which agreed with them, and by a small minority of the socialists at first. They did manage to take over the government. They really manipulated the government the last 2 years of the Civil War and carried out their program. But it came a bit late. They were not sufficiently successful in concentrating on the Civil War and therefore lost the conflict altogether. And Franco therefore ended up as the complete dictator of Spain in 1939.
Of course, 1939 was the end of the war, but it was also the year that the Second World War began. I understand that Spain adopted a neutral position throughout the war. I wonder, was that just a practical concern on Franco's part because they had to rebuild the country after the war, or were there other concerns involved?
It was certainly a practical concern. No one in Europe was more pragmatic than Franco during World War II. But he did try to play all sides. The situation that Franco was in was that the two powers that really supported him during the Civil War were Italy and Germany. There were no strings attached, as in the case of the communists on the Republican side. And Franco had complete power in Spain, but his principal friends and supporters abroad were Italy and Germany, now involved in beginning a major war in Europe. Franco, frankly, as a pragmatist, a practical man, was horrified because Spain in 1939 was prostrate. Its economy had been ruined temporarily by the Civil War. It was in no condition to engage in another struggle. When the Civil War began, Franco declared Spanish neutrality. It was the only position he could declare. On the other hand, within 9 months, Hitler had won a complete victory in France. And the entire war in Europe, it looked like, had been won by Germany in less than a year. Now, the decision Franco had to make then was he going to be outside the victorious circle? Was he going to become opposed to the new victors and dominators of Europe? Or was he going to join the winning side? His immediate choice in 1940 was, well, the only practical thing is to join the winning side. But we can't just jump in the war because Britain has not surrendered. And if Spain simply jumped in the war, it was in a geographically very exposed position, dependent on the international economy, on imports and exports. It could be done great damage by Britain being at war with Britain on the side of Germany, and therefore Spain had to be very careful. So Franco declared his support for Germany, withdrew from neutrality to a position called non-belligerence. Non-belligerence is a status suddenly defined in international law by Mussolini in 1940. It doesn't really exist. It's a pure invention. Meaning that you're not in the war, you're not a belligerent, but you have a tilt toward one side, toward the side of Nazi Germany. And this was the Spanish position, but Franco wanted to negotiate any terms of entering the war on Hitler's side to be sure that Hitler provided enough support and concessions for Spain would really be worthwhile and bolster Spain's position once the war was over. So Franco wanted to name a price, and his price is very high. He wanted to take over all of French Morocco, as well as much of French Equatorial Africa, get a lot of economic support and a lot of military support. For some time, during the second half of 1940, Hitler was very interested in having Spain enter the war on his side, because this would help stack the deck even more against Great Britain and close off the Mediterranean, doom the British situation in the Middle East, make it easier to seal off the Middle East, and for Germany to take over all the oil in the Middle East in the long run. So he wanted Franco in. Franco could do the Axis side a good deal of good, but he could not pay Franco's price. Hitler had ended the French war by making a deal with France, recognizing the new French satellite regime that governed half of France in the Vichy regime of Marshal Pétain. The Vichy regime also had the entire enormous French colonial empire in the Middle East and in North and West Africa. So he could not alienate Vichy altogether. Franco was demanding too much, and Germany did not have the extra military strength and the extra economic supplies to provide all the support that a very weak Spain required. So he tried to bargain Franco down, and Franco was a tough bargainer. We're not going to make a big mistake and get in the war on the wrong foot, he said, although it's to our interest to get in the war if we can get the right terms. And so the bargaining went on through 1940 into 1941, but Franco never got the right terms. And then as the United States came into the war and Britain became stronger, the Soviet Union was now on the other side. It looked as though Hitler was going to win the war, and Franco went back to full neutrality late in 1942. He was hedging his bets even more and hoped to achieve good relations with Britain and the United States by the end of World War II, but they didn't see it that way. Churchill had a rather high opinion of Franco and was grateful to Franco for not coming into war against Great Britain. But the American government, particularly, its usual moralistic approach that the Franco regime was the last remaining fascist regime and it really needed to be toppled, not invaded. There were elements in the Roosevelt White House that wanted to invade Spain in the later phases of World War II, but the American military said, this is silly. You're just going to divide our strength. We're not going to get anywhere with that. It's entirely secondary. We're not concerned with defeating Franco, who menaces no one, with defeating Hitler. So the United States did not insist on military intervention in Spain, which could have started a nasty war again. But in the ostracism of Franco, his regime was not invited to join the United Nations. And by 1946, the leadership of most governments in the world had withdrawn their diplomatic representation from Spain, and Spain remained isolated for the next couple of years, participating in international trade and in certain kinds of international agreements, but in a situation of ostracism, in which Franco was finally saved by the Cold War, which was really a kind of confrontation by 1947, and more moderates and conservatives, and especially the American military leaders, are saying, we need Spain's support in the Cold War because this can be an important military strategic position against the Soviet Union. The ostracism began to come to an end in 1949, and by 1953, Spain had become a kind of de facto ally of the United States with new military agreements for American military bases in Spain under the Strategic Air Command, American bombers, and American military and political assistance to Spain. The regime was never rehabilitated in the political eyes of West European governments. Spain was not admitted to NATO in 1949. Spain always remained apart, but an ally of the United States, which was number one, that encouraged great stability in Spain. And Franco remained in this position.
So how has the nature of the Franco regime changed over time?
Died peacefully in bed in 1975 at the age of 82. He was, in his own terms, at the time he died, the most successful dictator of the 20th century, not because he had made his country a superpower like Stalin, but because he had transformed his country and made it a prosperous modern country for the first time in its history in 1975. And he had maintained political reforms, though with more and more liberalizing reforms, and had defeated all his political enemies, domestic and foreign, so that he survived all the way down to his very end. And it was some political achievement, no doubt.
So how has the Franco dictatorship changed over time?
Well, it lived in two different, almost politically opposed eras. It came to power during the fascist era, between 1936 and 1939, and lived through World War II, the height of Nazi Germany. And Franco had decided, after the Civil War began, that a successful counter-revolutionary regime in Spain had to be a completely new kind of regime that adopted a new model of a one-party state and a kind of national counter-revolution that was also a national revolution. You defeated the revolutionaries with a national revolution, not a leftist revolution, but a national revolution. One-party state, and this party was the Falange. Franco was not really a political fascist because he did not politically understand or feel fascism as a kind of intense revolutionary nationalism. But he was aligned with this trend in European politics, even though he said that the regime we're creating is a provisional regime for the crisis of the Civil War, and it will be modified and reformed as we go along and improve it and make it better and better in the future. Well, what he found, of course, beginning in 1943, was the start of the downfall of fascism, and that his regime would have to become an almost completely post-fascist regime. So there began as early as 1943, in the middle of this World War II, a slow de-fascistization of the Franco regime, which went on for 32 years, and perhaps was never quite complete even by 1975. It always retained a few vestiges in the role, particularly of the state party, which had begun as a fascist regime and evolved into a post-fascist, largely non-fascist, single party of an authoritarian system in a different, more liberal and democratizing kind of era. So it is paradoxical But he always kept the state party because he said you need to have a base of organized political support. And he believed that he was creating not just a Latin American style military dictatorship. He said military dictatorships are a dime a dozen. They never last. He was creating a new political system around a state party with a set of constitutional laws, the leyes fundamentales, the fundamental laws of the state, which create a new kind of corporative representative system, what was called organic, corporatively organized democracy, as distinct from inorganic, direct election parliamentary democracy. Well, critics said this was a lot of gobbledygook, and in some respects it was. There was an attempt to create an alternative kind of system. And even though it became more and more liberal, late Francoism was a very liberal kind of authoritarian regime. He believed that to some extent, though it would continue to evolve and become more liberal, it would survive him even after 1975. And in that, he was mistaken.
Okay. So give us an overview about the nationalist movements. By that, I mean the Catalan and the Basque movements under the Franco regime.
The Franco regime was the first Spanish regime of modern nationalism, a mostly centralized regime that only allowed a very minor degree of administrative autonomy for the Basque movement of Álava, the smallest, least important Basque province, and for the province of Navarre, because the leaders of Álava and Navarre had supported Franco during the Civil War. So it was strongly opposed to what it called separatism, which was separatism on the part of Basque and Catalan nationalists, emphasized the recognition of Basque and Catalan culture, but as part of Spanish culture, and no direct political autonomy, everything part of a single centrally organized system. Basque nationalists, however, were not as severely repressed as other elements of the left during and after the Civil War, because Basque nationalists were not leftists. They were the only part of the Republican coalition that was officially Catholic. They were a Catholic political movement allied with a radical anti-Catholic political regime with a single goal of Basque autonomy and, if possible, Basque separation from the Republic. So it wasn't that the separatists were condemned to the most severe repression. They were repressed, but not as severely as some others were, because their politics had been more moderate. In the case of the Basques, had been pro-Catholic. And by the 1950s, when I first went to Spain, Basque nationalism was very weak. I remember in December 1959 being taken to meet the underground leader of Basque nationalism, Juan Guerra, in Bilbao, in a dimly lit bar in a worker neighborhood. And it seemed pretty clear that Basque nationalism really had no very strong structured resistance at that time. But later on, with the growth of political dissidence in Europe in the 1960s, and with the moderation of the Franco regime, and more liberties, the right to carry out publication more and more in Catalan and in Basque, and maintain very active Catalan and Basque regional cultures, this began to grow rapidly again. And in Franco's last years, the greatest difficulty he had, politically in fact, was not with the remnants of the old revolutionary left, not with the left, but with the Catalan and Basque separatists, particularly with the Basques.
So I'd like to end on this note. So Franco's regime ends when ostensibly his passing. And I wonder, during the last years of his regime, did he foresee that Spain would become a different country, perhaps a democracy upon his passing, or did he have a plan for succession?
This is the $64 question
Hmm.
about the death of Franco. And the answer is kind of yes and no. Around 1970, Richard Nixon sent his chief interpreter, the later CIA director, General Bernard Walters, would be to interview Franco and see what Franco thought was going to be the future of Spain. And Franco told Walters, President Nixon doesn't need to worry. We have everything well organized. After I die, the regime will not be the same. Prince Juan Carlos will take over the regime, be king of Spain, and things will become more liberal. As in fact, we've already liberalized while I was still alive. So things will become more liberal. And it will be like a more liberal kind of regime, but the basic regime in its fundamentals will still survive because we have everything very well organized. That's what Franco thought. But by the final months of his life, in 1975, he realized that most public opinion in Spain was expecting a basic change after he died. Was expecting it, and I will insist on it, and that his chosen heir, Prince Juan Carlos, had told the moderate leaders of the opposition there would be a basic change. He was going in the direction of a liberal, democratic, parliamentary monarchy, and not maintaining the peculiar structure of the Franco regime. Franco probably began to understand that in the final months. But by that time, he was physically very weak, suffering from Parkinson's disorder. He maintained a clear mind. He did not become demented or delusionary, but he realized that he just had no energy left, no political strength to make any other changes. He had bet everything on the succession of Juan Carlos, who was going to inherit all of Franco's power, and he would have to leave it up to Juan Carlos to carry on or transform the institutions of the regime as he saw fit. And what Juan Carlos did was to carry out an unprecedented maneuver. He had one very good political advisor, Torquato Fernandez Miranda, who had been one of the leaders of the Franco state, who showed him how to do something that had never been done before in world history. And that was to use the laws and institutions of a long-term, solidly established authoritarian regime to carry out a transformation of that same regime into a liberal democratic system. And that's what happened in Spain, step by step, between 1975 and 1978. So the Franco regime was unprecedented in Spanish history, and it led to a political transformation that, in its own terms, was at that time unprecedented in world history. Everything done legally, without direct violence, without military intervention, without any upset, from the law to the law, simply using the established law for a legal reform process that ended in almost total political transformation.
And on that note, thank you very much, Professor Stanley Payne, for joining the show.
My pleasure. Good to be here.